Every story has its moment. Mine comes at 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe, and be here when the story is finally told. By the late summer of 1944, the Japanese coastal position had settled into a routine defined by exhaustion rather than combat. The garrison was small, isolated by distance and poor supply lines, and tasked with holding ground that no longer appeared strategically decisive, yet could not be abandoned. The men were underfed, overworked, and conscious that reinforcement was unlikely. Discipline, maintained through repetition and regulation, was the primary defense against fatigue and fear. The investigation begins with Lieutenant Masao Kondo, a company-grade officer in his early 30s assigned as acting security officer for the position. Kondo had served in China earlier in the war and later in New Guinea, where disease and attrition had shaped his understanding of loss more than direct combat. He was not an investigator by training, but in a garrison this size, responsibility defaulted upward to whoever remained capable and present. His immediate goal was simple: determine whether the unit faced a security failure or a lapse in discipline that could spread panic. The first body is discovered just before dawn. A sentry assigned to a coastal observation point is found slumped behind a sandbag wall, rifle still secured, helmet in place. There are no signs of struggle. No alarm had been raised. A single gunshot wound is visible beneath the left collarbone. The surrounding area shows no footprints beyond those expected from routine patrols. Kondo orders a standard incident report, already anticipating the explanation that will follow: accidental discharge, mishandling, or exhaustion-induced negligence. 2 days later, a second death occurs under nearly identical conditions, this time at an inland listening post. Again, no alarm. Again, a single wound. The man had been known as reliable, quiet, and physically fit. Kondo reads the patrol log himself, noting nothing irregular. He feels the first trace of doubt, but suppresses it. Multiple incidents suggest a pattern, yet acknowledging that pattern would mean admitting a failure of control inside the perimeter. At this stage of the war, such admissions carried professional consequences. Medical examination is conducted by Surgeon Lieutenant Hiroshi Arai, a reservist doctor pulled into service from civilian practice. Arai had spent the previous year treating tropical infections and malnutrition rather than trauma. He notes that the wound channels are clean and narrow, but he withholds judgment, aware that speculation without evidence could undermine command cohesion. He limits his written report to observable facts, leaving interpretation to line officers. A third soldier is killed the following week. This time, the death occurs during daylight hours, under conditions that should have offered visibility and security. The body is found seated against a supply crate, posture unchanged, as if the man had not understood what was happening before it ended. Kondo visits the site personally. He notices the stillness of the area, the absence of any signs of alarm or reaction. He feels a growing pressure to provide certainty where none exists. Among the enlisted men, rumors begin quietly. Some speak of careless handling of captured weapons. Others suggest a nervous sentry firing and covering it up. Kondo listens, but does not encourage discussion. His role, as he understands it, is to contain doubt. He briefs his superiors with restraint, emphasizing fatigue, poor lighting, and the cumulative strain of prolonged duty. Internally, he weighs responsibility against the limited evidence available, aware that escalation without proof could destabilize the entire position. By the end of the opening phase, the situation appears outwardly controlled. Patrols continue. Orders are followed. Official explanations remain administrative rather than tactical. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere has changed. Soldiers are quieter at their posts. Officers reread reports more carefully. No one can explain how 3 men died without warning, without noise, and without witnesses. The investigation has begun not as a search for an enemy, but as an attempt to preserve order in a place where certainty is already in short supply. The fourth death occurred in the early afternoon, under clear weather and full visibility, conditions that should have made any hostile action immediately noticeable. The soldier was found near a communications trench, positioned where foot traffic was common and observation constant. His rifle was unloaded, placed neatly beside him, as if set down with care. The wound was again singular, precise, and fatal. There was no sign that he had attempted to move or call out. The absence of urgency in the scene disturbed those who examined it, even if they did not openly say so. Lieutenant Kondo arrived shortly after the body was reported. He stood longer this time, looking past the immediate surroundings and into the angles of terrain, the spacing of structures, and the lines of sight that had once seemed irrelevant. His earlier confidence in routine explanations weakened. Accidents did not repeat themselves with this level of consistency. Friendly fire required proximity and confusion. Neither was present. The responsibility he carried shifted from maintaining discipline to preventing further loss, and the distinction between the two became increasingly difficult to separate. Surgeon Lieutenant Arai conducted the examination with greater attention than before. He measured the entry wound carefully, noting its uniformity across all 4 cases. The internal damage suggested a projectile that lacked the velocity typical of standard military rifles. Bone fragmentation was limited. The path was direct, controlled, and deliberate. Arai recorded these observations without drawing conclusions, but he requested access to the previous body's reports for comparison. The similarities were no longer coincidental. They suggested intention. Kondo reviewed the guard rosters personally. None of the men assigned near the incidents had reported hearing a shot. No muzzle flash had been observed. Ammunition counts showed no discrepancies. Theories that once seemed adequate now required increasing levels of assumption. He began to suspect that the framework through which the problem was being viewed was flawed. Yet he lacked an alternative explanation that could be defended within the structure of command. The pressure spread quietly through the unit. Sentries began to double-check their surroundings without being ordered. Men lingered less during conversations and returned to their posts early. No formal alert was issued, but behavior changed. Kondo noticed it during inspections. He recognized the signs from earlier campaigns, the point at which uncertainty begins to erode confidence faster than enemy action. A limited internal review was authorized, framed officially as a safety audit. It focused on weapon handling, fatigue, and procedural compliance. This direction reassured higher command, but frustrated those closest to the incidents. The findings explained nothing. No disciplinary violations were uncovered. The explanation that remained on paper was exhaustion. The explanation that lingered in private thought was something else entirely. Arai approached Kondo after submitting his report. He did not challenge authority or propose theories. He simply stated that the wounds did not align with the weapons issued to the unit. Kondo listened without interruption. He understood the implication immediately and also understood why it could not yet be voiced openly. To accept that conclusion would mean acknowledging an unknown threat operating freely within or near the position. That evening, Kondo walked the perimeter alone, without escort, stopping at each location where a man had fallen. He paid attention to distances, elevation, and cover. He did not yet know what he was looking for, only that previous assumptions had narrowed his vision. The deaths no longer appeared random or internal. They appeared selective. By nightfall, no orders had changed and no announcements were made. Officially, the situation remained stable. Unofficially, the investigation had shifted from identifying negligence to confronting the possibility of an enemy that did not fit established doctrine. Kondo understood that once such a possibility was acknowledged, it could not be contained easily. The calm of the position remained intact, but it was now under strain, held together by restraint rather than certainty. The decision to widen scrutiny beyond the garrison was made quietly and without formal announcement. It began with logistics rather than suspicion. Inventory officers reported minor inconsistencies in scrap storage near the shoreline dump, material collected from wreckage and discarded equipment and kept for potential reuse. None of it was classified as weapons grade, and none of it was supposed to matter. Still, the timing aligned too closely with the deaths to ignore. Lieutenant Kondo approved a limited review of civilian labor assignments. The position relied on local workers for hauling supplies, clearing vegetation, and maintaining access paths. They moved freely through areas soldiers rarely questioned, their presence normalized by months of routine. Kondo did not initially see them as a threat, but command pressure demanded a tangible direction, something that could be examined and reported without challenging doctrine. One labor drew attention after a patrol reported finding him near a disused firing slit along the inland ridge. He carried a canvas bag filled with metal fragments, bent brackets, and short lengths of tubing. The items were ordinary in isolation, the kind gathered daily for barter or repair. What made the report notable was the location and the timing. The man was detained without resistance. Interrogation was conducted by an intelligence sergeant with experience in occupied territories. The questioning was methodical, translated through an interpreter whose loyalty was assumed rather than verified. The detainee denied wrongdoing consistently. He explained his movements in practical terms, assigned routes, collected materials, exchanged favors. His account contained no contradictions, but it also offered no reassurance. Kondo observed the session from the edge of the room, aware that suspicion had begun to fill the gaps left by evidence. While the interrogation continued, another soldier was killed. This time the shot came from a direction previously thought irrelevant, an angle that bypassed established defensive logic. The body was found near a supply cache, partially concealed by terrain that had not been surveyed in detail. The timing undermined the focus on internal sabotage. The detainee had been in custody for hours. Surgeon Lieutenant Arai examined the wound and confirmed that it matched the others precisely. There was no deviation in depth, no change in entry angle relative to posture. The consistency suggested control rather than improvisation. Arai documented everything and said little. The silence carried its own weight. The detained labor was released later that evening. No apology was offered. He left the compound under guard escort, his status unclear, his future uncertain. The episode closed one line of inquiry, but left behind an uncomfortable residue. Kondo recognized the error immediately. The investigation had been shaped by convenience rather than probability. Morale shifted subtly after that night. Soldiers began requesting reassignment from exposed posts. Officers denied the requests but made informal adjustments, rotating men more frequently without explanation. The fear was no longer of punishment or negligence, but of exposure to something unseen and unacknowledged. Kondo reviewed the incident reports again, this time removing assumptions he had previously accepted. He noticed details he had dismissed before: the consistent lack of reaction at each scene, the absence of secondary wounds, the precise placement of each shot. These are not the marks of panic or opportunity. They were deliberate. By the end of the chapter's events, the investigation had narrowed rather than expanded. Internal explanations had failed. External ones had been mishandled. What remained was a growing recognition that the threat operated independently of established categories. The pressure on command increased, not from superiors, but from the quiet understanding among those on the ground that something fundamental had been misunderstood, and that delay was no longer neutral. The next phase of the inquiry began without formal authorization, driven less by orders than by the accumulation of details that no longer fit within existing explanations. Lieutenant Kondo requested assistance from 2nd Lieutenant Kenji Morita, an engineering officer assigned to coastal fortification maintenance. Morita had spent most of the war constructing defenses rather than engaging in combat, first in the Philippines and later on smaller island positions where terrain mattered more than firepower. His value lay in how he read ground, angles, elevation, blind spots, rather than how he commanded men. Morita approached the task cautiously. He did not assume hostile action at first. He began by walking the site as it existed, not as it was supposed to function on paper. He measured distances with pacing, checked elevations by eye, and traced the likely lines of visibility from each location where a soldier had been killed. What emerged was not a perimeter problem, but a convergence. Several of the fatal angles intersected beyond the established defensive boundary from terrain that had never been incorporated into planning because it was considered unusable for conventional attack. The terrain itself explained why it had been ignored. The ridge was uneven, partially collapsed in places, and overgrown with vegetation that made sustained movement difficult. It offered no clear path for infantry and no space for artillery or heavy weapons. Under normal doctrine, it held no tactical value. Yet Morita identified narrow, stable points where a single individual could remain concealed for long periods with minimal movement. During a daylight inspection, Morita recovered small metal fragments embedded in a sandbag near one of the firing locations. They were not bullet casings. They were irregular, flattened, and scored in a way that suggested secondary impact rather than discharge residue. When compared with debris collected from earlier sites, the composition appeared similar. Aluminum alloy, light but dense enough to fragment under force. Kondo reviewed Morita's findings in silence. The implication was clear but difficult to accept. The wounds, the fragments, the angles, all suggested a weapon that did not align with issued equipment or known enemy arms. The possibility that an individual, isolated and unsupported, was responsible challenged not only training but institutional confidence. Kondo understood why earlier reports had been dismissed. Accepting this meant admitting that established assumptions had created vulnerability. Surgeon Lieutenant Arai was brought into the discussion privately. He confirmed that the fragment composition matched what he had observed embedded in tissue during examination. He also noted the absence of typical rifling marks, suggesting a smooth or irregular barrel. The conclusion was clinical, not speculative. The projectile behavior was consistent across cases. Despite the mounting evidence, command response remained restrained. Patrol routes were adjusted, but only incrementally. Observation posts were reinforced, but the ridge remained officially unclassified as a threat axis. The reluctance was not denial, but caution, fear that acknowledging such an anomaly would invite panic or expose earlier failures. Another attack followed, this time narrowly missing its intended target. The round struck a wooden support beam, embedding deep enough to be recovered intact. The projectile was crude, uneven, and visibly improvised. It was the first physical object that could not be explained away. Kondo held it in his hand longer than necessary, aware that it represented both confirmation and condemnation. The atmosphere within the position shifted decisively. Orders were still obeyed, routines still followed, but trust in established explanations eroded. Men no longer questioned whether someone was responsible. They questioned why that responsibility had taken so long to be acknowledged. By the end of this phase, the investigation had changed character. It was no longer about preventing negligence or identifying internal failure. It was about confronting an adversary defined not by numbers or doctrine, but by adaptation and persistence. The pressure on leadership became internalized, measured not in reprimands, but in the growing understanding that delay had already cost lives and that further hesitation would do the same. Once the recovered projectile was cataloged, the investigation moved from inference to verification. Lieutenant Kondo ordered a controlled review of recent crash sites within reachable distance of the position, focusing on material loss rather than aircraft identification. Several weeks earlier, an enemy fighter had gone down inland, dismissed at the time as irrelevant wreckage beyond recovery range. Now, engineering records were reopened. Salvage reports showed that key structural components had never been retrieved, not because they were destroyed, but because the terrain had made recovery inconvenient and low priority. Second Lieutenant Morita accompanied a small inspection team to the site under guard. The wreckage was scattered but orderly in its destruction, suggesting impact rather than explosion. Several sections of aluminum framing had been cut rather than torn. Fasteners were missing. A section of steel tubing, originally part of a landing gear assembly, had been deliberately removed. These were not the actions of scavengers. They reflected selection. Surgeon Lieutenant Arai compared the recovered metal from the crash site with the projectile fragments taken from the wounded timber support. The alloy composition matched closely. The surface scoring suggested hand shaping with limited tools. The conclusion was unavoidable. The weapon responsible for the deaths had been built, not issued. Information from local villages was gathered quietly through intermediaries who had maintained working relationships with the garrison. Reports described a wounded foreign soldier seen weeks earlier, moving alone, favoring one leg, trading personal items for food. He avoided roads, traveled at irregular intervals, and returned repeatedly toward the ridge. These accounts were consistent across locations and time frames, even when provided separately. The investigation team reconstructed a likely firing position based on terrain analysis and witness movement patterns. They identified a narrow depression with natural cover and sufficient stability to support repeated use. The area showed signs of long-term occupation, compressed soil, minimal waste, and controlled disturbance. Whoever had been there understood concealment and patience. A sweep operation was authorized with specific constraints. No artillery, no random firing. Movement was to be deliberate, quiet, and sustained over daylight hours, denying the attacker the cover he had relied upon. The unit involved consisted of experienced infantrymen selected for discipline rather than aggression. Contact occurred briefly and at close range. The individual was found alone, armed with the improvised firearm and limited ammunition. He attempted to withdraw, but was killed before escaping the perimeter. There was no exchange beyond a few seconds. No words were spoken. The recovered weapon was examined on site. It was crude but functional, assembled from aircraft components, reinforced with wire and fabric binding. The firing mechanism was unstable, requiring careful handling. Ammunition consisted of modified rounds incompatible with standard weapons. The construction explained the long intervals between attacks and the precision of each shot. When the body was identified, it confirmed what evidence had already established. He had been isolated, wounded, and unsupported. His effectiveness had come not from firepower, but from the ability to exploit assumption and delay. By the conclusion of the operation, the attacks had ended. The investigation had reached certainty. What remained was not pursuit, but accounting of decisions made, warnings dismissed, and time lost. The weapon and associated materials were secured for documentation. Orders were issued to restore normal posture. Outwardly, the position returned to routine. Internally, the understanding was clear that the threat had been real long before it was acknowledged, and that recognition had come only after consequence. In the days following the sweep, the position entered a period of formal reckoning. Activity did not stop, but it slowed, becoming procedural rather than reactive. The weapon, its remaining ammunition, and all recovered fragments were cataloged under controlled conditions. Measurements were taken, materials logged, and photographs produced with technical precision. The documentation avoided interpretation. It focused on construction, composition, and function, leaving judgment to command review. Lieutenant Kondo prepared the final report. He wrote carefully, aware that the language would determine not only responsibility, but legacy. He detailed the timeline of deaths, the evolving assessments, and the moments where available evidence had not aligned with accepted explanations. He did not dramatize. He did not defend. He recorded decisions as they occurred, including his own hesitation. The weight of authorship was heavier than command in the field. In writing, there was no cover. Surgeon Lieutenant Arai submitted his medical conclusions separately. His report was precise and unemotional, describing wound consistency, projectile behavior, and the limitations of early assumptions. He included an addendum noting that earlier conclusions had been constrained by expectations rather than observation. It was the closest he came to criticism. Within the medical corps, it was understood. Second Lieutenant Morita returned to his engineering duties. Before doing so, he revised the defensive schematics of the position, incorporating terrain previously dismissed as irrelevant. The changes were minor on paper, but significant in implication. The ground had not changed. the understanding of it had. Command response arrived weeks later. There were no public reprimands, no visible punishment. Official correspondence acknowledged delays in threat recognition and cited the need for adaptability under non-standard conditions. Certain officers were reassigned quietly. Training directives were amended to emphasize unconventional risks and the limits of doctrine. The language was restrained, but the message was clear. Among the enlisted men, the atmosphere shifted towards something more subdued than relief. The knowledge that the deaths had been preventable did not manifest as anger, but as restraint. Names were remembered. Posts once considered routine were treated with attention. The silence that followed the end of the attacks was not celebratory. It was reflective. Kondo visited the sites one last time before rotation orders arrived. He did not linger. The ground showed no sign of what had occurred beyond faint repairs and replaced sandbags. That absence troubled him more than damage would have. The events had left no visible trace, only procedural change and internal adjustment. The incident did not enter public record. It was filed among internal reports, referenced rarely and without emphasis. In the broader context of the war, it altered nothing strategic. Locally, it reshaped how decisions were made under uncertainty. When the unit eventually moved on, the position remained intact, quiet, and functional. The investigation had ended not with recognition or praise, but with correction. Accountability had been measured, not announced. The closure was complete, not because the outcome was satisfying, but because every action, delay, and consequence had been acknowledged and recorded. The matter was finished, and the war continued elsewhere.